I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, Russia has asked for a meeting on the military biological activity of Ukraine for the third time now. I'll explain why. We continue to receive very worrying documentary evidence of the fact that the Ministry of Defense of the United States is directly involved in carrying out in the country dangerous biological projects that look like a secret biological military program. This activity is being carried out in the center of Eastern Europe and on the western borders of Russia. It is a real threat to the biosecurity of our country, the region, and, given the cross-border nature of these biothreats, to the whole world. There is no information on this in the reporting stipulated by the Bio and Toxin Weapons Convention from Ukraine or from the United States, as was confirmed by Mr. Markram. Preventing this dangerous activity is possible only through our special military operation. Since the previous meeting, 2 months have passed and we've received much new evidence. All of these materials we have placed on through the Security Council, and I'd like to draw your attention to the most salient pieces of information here. As comes from the documentation on Project 3007, monitoring of epidemiological and the environmental situation with the proliferation in Ukraine of dangerous waterborne diseases, Ukrainian specialists, under the supervision of American colleagues, have regularly carried out collection of water samples from rivers flowing through Ukraine, including the Dnieper, the Danube and the Dniester, and also the North Crimean Canal. The aim here is to establish the presence in them of specific dangerous pathogens, including cholera, typhoid, hepatitis A and E, and to evaluate the way in which they spread through the water in order to draw conclusions on the ability of these pathogens to incapacitate. Then the collections of these samples were sent to the United States. We have a logical question. Why? Why is a collection of dangerous pathogens being collected by the United States, which might then spread through the waters of this region? Even a look at a Ukrainian map of the water sources in that country is enough to understand that the results of this scientific experiment might be used to create a biological catastrophe, not only in Russia, but on the whole through the waters of the Azov and Black Seas and in Eastern Europe, including Belarus, Moldova and Poland. The documents say that the Kiev regime is trying to receive access to the technical means to deliver dangerous bioagents through the air. Last year, the Ukrainian side asked the Turkish manufacturer of drones, Baykar Makina, whether it was possible to equip the drone Bayraktar with an aerosol equipment that would allow it to spread aerosols, more than 20 litres of them, over a distance of 300 kilometres. While in flight. A copy of this letter was disseminated by us on the 19th of April in the document collection that we had then. This system, given the distance of the flight, would represent a real threat of the broad use of dangerous bioaerosols across the territory of the Russian Federation. There is information that in January this year, Ukraine, through intermediaries, received more than 50 such devices equipped with systems to spray biological and chemical substances. On the 9th of March this year, 3 such drones equipped with 30-litre containers and spray systems were found by our military in the Kherson region. A further 10 were noted at the end of April in Kakhovka region. Our Ministry of Defense has received shocking evidence that a number of projects which the Pentagon is carrying out on Ukrainian territory represent risk to the life and health of volunteers, Ukrainian citizens. The documentation on the project UP8 stipulates that when there are small incidents with the people involved, then these must be reported to the US Bioethics Committee within 72 hours. And when there are serious events, including the death of the volunteers, within 24 hours. In other words, these experiments from the outset stipulate that they might be lethal, even though in the official project documentation it simply says that there's a standard procedure to collect blood. What kind of blood samples are being taken when the subjects might actually die? There is also evidence of the direct involvement of the political establishment in the United States in financing the military and biological activities in Ukraine through subcontractors from the Pentagon, such as Black & Veatch and Metabiota. The aims, however, were far from scientific. In a letter from the Vice President of Metabiota in particular, it says that its aim in Ukraine was to guarantee, and I quote, the cultural and economic independence of Ukraine from Russia, end quote. To put it mildly, this is an unusual objective for a biotech company. In previous meetings, we informed the Security Council that in Ukraine, with the financing and direct involvement of the US Ministry of Defense through its Defense Threat Reduction Agency, there is a network of biolaboratories that are carrying out various pieces of military biological research. According to preliminary data, this network covers Kiev, Odessa, Lvov, Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, Kherson, Ternopil, Uzhgorod, and Vinnytsia. In this list, we can now add Mariupol. There are 2 biolaboratories in the city where we found evidence of the speedy destruction of documents that confirm that it was working with the American military establishment. The preliminary analysis of the documentation shows that in Mariupol, it's being used as a regional center for the collection and for a passport system for cholera pathogens. The samples that were collected were sent to the Center of Public Health in Kiev, which has the function to further then send on the biomaterial to the United States. This activity has been going on since 2014, as confirmed by the documents covering the distribution of the samples. There's also a health epidemiological laboratory in Mariupol, where we found a document suggesting that a collection of pathogen were destroyed, and that document's from the 25th of February 2022. According to it, there was work with cholera pathogens, also pathogens for deer fly fever, anthrax, in other words, with various potential bioagents. Part of the connection of a veterinary laboratory wasn't destroyed in a hurry. Their specialists found pathogens which aren't really usual for veterinary illnesses, such as typhus, paratyphus, and gas gangrene. Last time we talked about the sharp increase in recent years in the Lugansk and Donetsk republics of cases of tuberculosis caused by new, different, multi-resistant samples. We've also grounds to understand that this is not by chance that this has happened. There was also a bio-incident which took place in 2020 in the in a region of Lugansk. There it turned out that among children in Stepovoye, we found false money, which were then used as a carrier for tuberculosis. There, the idea was that the children, when touching this money, would then pick it up on their unwashed hands. The analysis showed that this money was infected with a bioactive tuberculosis, which would resist the various different medications that could be used against tuberculosis. The idea that the bacteria naturally ended up on these pieces of money is not true. The concentration of the pathogen was too high, which wouldn't be found in natural conditions where there is sunlight and where there is also active bacteria could die. In other words, there's everything to suggest that this was a laboratory infection of this money with the bioagent itself. Fortunately, nobody was a victim of this, but on the whole, we can see that this is a confirmation of a very worrying trend. I'd also like to get into another subject, which is another clear demonstration of how, in fact, the Kiev regime and its Western sponsors think about the Ukrainian people. There is evidence that American scientists from a laboratory in Merev have carried out experiments of potentially dangerous biological substances on patients in a local psychiatric hospital, hospital number 3 in Kharkov. Similar inhumane experiments took place in psychiatric hospital number 1 in Strelets in Kharkov region. The main category of the patients there was a group of patients who were men aged between 40 and 60 with very severe physical problems. All of this research was carried out secretly, and Ukrainian colleagues signed a non-disclosure agreement. To cover the American experts, they were brought in through third countries so that it was kept secret. As the information comes in about the activities of biolaboratories in Ukraine, we have questions to their allies, the United States, and through NATO. New documents show that between 2016 and 2019, military epidemiologists from the Institute of Microbiology and the Bundeswehr, the German army in other words, they brought in samples of blood from their citizens who living in 25 different regions in Ukraine. What was the aim for the German armed forces to be involved in collecting samples from Ukrainian citizens? There's also documentation that confirms Poland's involvement together with the key contractors from the Pentagon, in particular the American company Betel, through biological research on Ukrainian territory. Mr. President, I think that today, once again, we will hear from our Western colleagues that there will be accusations that this is propaganda and there's a lack of evidence. This is why we are devoting a great deal of attention to documentary evidence and to regularly distributing through the Security Council and the General Assembly the originals of these documents, which have come into the hands of our Ministry of Defence. With them, everybody can read these documents. There are hundreds of pages of documents signed by specific people, specific officials in the US and Ukraine. They show that they wanted to hide from the international community what the Kiev regime and Western colleagues were doing. American representatives have refused to give explanations about the character and the real aims of their activity in the biological sphere in Ukraine and around the world in a whole. In a preparatory document to the 9th Review Conference of the Biological Weapons Convention in Geneva at its session in the beginning of April, the Americans once again did not give any clear answer, besides waving away the idea that the biological activities of the United States by definition were peaceful and useful for the international community. On the 6th of April, there was a meeting in the Area Formula where there were independent journalists who asked for clarification from the United States, including about why documents about American-Ukrainian cooperation on biodevelopments contradicted the statements of American officials. But the delegations of the United States and the United Kingdom simply didn't come to that meeting. There's another very salient fact here. During the course of the meeting that I mentioned, of the preparatory committee, the US delegation once again rejected the proposal to create an effective verification mechanism for compliance with the BWC. They refused to renew work on a corresponding legally binding protocol to the convention, which the USA has been blocking since 2001. Our initiative was to add trust measures to the CWC through reporting on military biological activity beyond national territory, but the American representatives also rejected this proposal. In other words, the United States is deliberately blocking attempts to strengthen the BWC regime, aimed to allow it to effectively keep violating the convention. All of these are very worrying signals, especially given that the American legislation allows for military biological activity, and the national legislation in this sphere has prevalence over the international legislation in the United States. I'd once again like to ask the representatives of the United States, if your wishes for biological laboratories to exist around the world, and in particular in Ukraine, as you say, then if this is truly peaceful, then why do you refuse to deliver them to international controls, and why do you impede the idea that the international community would have the necessary instruments for that control? This would be the simplest way to once and for all get rid of all doubts and accusations if, as you assert, they are completely foundless. Unfortunately, we simply only have another explanation, which is that you have something to hide. Colleagues, we have already accumulated a lot of materials that directly indicate that the United States and Ukraine are violating the BWC rather. We continue to collect these materials and analyze them. Given that the American party is refusing to engage in any constructive discussion on this subject, we plan to utilize the mechanism stipulated in Articles 5 and 6 of the BWC. As soon as work to collect the materials is completed, we will present them to the Council for an investigation. We hope that this will allow us to finally cut off the military biological activity which threatens international peace and security, and to bring those who are guilty to account. Thank you very much.
In my role as Council President, I thank the representative of Russia for his statement.